This is the evolution review. Evolution is a fact. It is an observable fact. The definition of evolution is that evolution is the process by which populations change over time. Now, evolution itself is observable. You can go out into the forest, you can go outside, you can do experiments where you can see that if the ratio of traits in a population changes, evolution has occurred. Okay, so however, the theory of evolution is how populations change. Not just that they do, evolution itself is just that they do change. The theory of evolution is how do they change. And the reason we say it most of the time as the theory of evolution by natural selection is because natural selection is how populations change. Natural selection is the process by which individuals that inherit advantageous traits or adaptations tend to survive and reproduce more successfully than individuals that don't. Okay, so let's review the steps of natural selection. First, we have overproduction. More babies are born than can survive to reproduce. So in nature, a plant or animal is going to make more offspring than the environment can support. Some will live to adulthood and even fewer will successfully reproduce. Now remember, evolution by natural selection is primarily driven by reproduction. Which organisms reproduce, which don't. So step one, overproduction. More babies are born than can survive to reproduce. Second, variation. There are differences in the traits among individuals within a population. Okay, so these could be either natural differences or new mutations that arise. However, variations that enhance an individual's ability to survive and reproduce may also increase the survival of the species due to natural selection. So let's keep going. So variation, there are differences. They may be already there, different versions of traits like blonde hair or brown hair, brown eyes, blue eyes, different things in organisms like fur color or anything like that. Next, we have selection. Now, I know if you were in a different class than mine, your teachers may call it the struggle to survive or competition. It's really the same thing, that individuals try to get the resources they need to survive and reproduce, including water, nutrients, food, space, mates, etc. If any one of those resources becomes scarce, if one of those individuals has a trait that allows him or her to survive and reproduce better than those without that trait, they will. Okay, so the competition, they have to compete for those resources, and the one with the better trait variation will get it. They will survive longer and therefore survive long enough to reproduce. And then last is that adaptation, that if that organism survives and reproduces, and as long as that trait is heritable, that trait will become more common in the next generation. Okay, if we think about Darwin's finches, the organisms with the large beaks were able to compete. They got that food resource, where the ones with the smaller beaks could not get that food source, and they died. They died without reproducing, and since they did not reproduce, they cannot pass their little beak genes onto the next generation. Only the ones with the larger beaks were around to reproduce, so their trait, that big beak, was passed on to the next generation. Okay, so if that advantageous trait or adaptation becomes more common in the next generation, the population has changed, and therefore evolution has occurred, okay? The ratio of traits in the population has changed, and therefore we have evolution. So now, 2 important points. If any part of natural selection is missing, the population will not change and evolution will not occur. And so, if the population is only producing enough organisms that the environment can support, there's not more, there's not less, you're not going to have evolution. If there's no genetic variation, if they are all exactly the same, then none of them will have a trait that allows one of them to perform better than another, and therefore evolution cannot occur. Selection, if there's no competition among organisms, if there's nothing that enables one of them to do better and survive longer and therefore reproduce, then that's not going to happen. And last, adaptation, if they don't reproduce, if that trait is not heritable, if it doesn't become more common in the next generation, then we're not going to have that adaptation component and evolution will not occur. And then last, if a population cannot adapt to a changing environment, the population or species as a whole may go extinct. Okay. So, what evidence do we have for evolution? We have 4 pieces of evidence that we discussed in class. Of course, there are many more, but these are just the ones that we have reviewed and will be featured on the test. We have fossils, DNA, embryology, and body structures. So, fossils show how species have changed over time. Okay, you can see small changes build up over millions of years. You know, in some of those worksheets we did, that the horses went from the dawn horse with 4 toes down to the modern horse, which now has only 1 toe, that hoof that we see them with today. While the fossil record is incomplete and only contains 0.01% of all organisms that have ever lived, the evidence that we do have shows that change. And specifically, we have transitional fossils like Tiktaalik and Archaeopteryx. Tiktaalik had these front-facing or top-facing eyes and these front fins that allowed it to lift itself onto the land. It showed the transition between sea and land animals. And then Archaeopteryx, here is the photo of the actual fossil that we have. It is a mold fossil, so, and it might also be preserved remain or mineral replacement. I'm not sure if those are the actual bones there or just the imprint, but regardless, this is what we have. And what we see here and here are the feathers, okay? So Archaeopteryx shows the transition between dinosaurs and birds. Rather than feathers designed for warmth, Archaeopteryx had feathers designed for flight, which we can see in this, and then this is just an artist's rendering of what it may have looked like, okay? Next, we have DNA. Remember, DNA is composed of genes, which are segments that determine the traits or characteristics of an organism. So by studying the similarities among DNA sequences, scientists can determine how recently 2 organisms shared a common ancestor. So this is a piece of a lab that I did with the advanced kids. But I'm just going to show 3 organisms and discuss how this shows evidence of common ancestry. So this is a sequence of DNA that codes for a beta-casein milk protein, and we can count the differences between these organisms. So I'm going to compare both the giraffe and the right whale to the cow, and I already have highlighted here that is 1, 2, 3 differences between the cow and the giraffe. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 differences between the cow and the right whale. So using this information, we can conclude that the giraffe and the cow share a closer common ancestor than the cow and the right whale. Okay, so this just shows that fully filled in chart that I did with the advanced kids, where right here we have the cow and the right whale, and right here we have the cow and the giraffe. And we see that there are 3 differences between the cow and the giraffe, 9 between the right whale and the cow. But we can see that there's all kinds of these other organisms here that are all related. And first, we know that they're all related because they all have this gene. It would be incredibly unlikely that 2 completely different organisms with no common ancestor would share this exact same gene, okay? Now, granted, there are some differences, and something like the peccary and the deer have 18 differences, and that seems like a whole lot, but ultimately, they do share a common ancestor. Now, a far more distant ancestor than, say, the sperm whale and the porpoise, but a common ancestor nonetheless. And we can see and compare these differences and how recently organisms shared common ancestors based on DNA evidence. Next, we have embryology. Now, this is kind of a blown-up photo, like what you saw in your packets and in our evidence of evolution worksheets. But we see that not only do all of these organisms, really, they look almost identical very, very early in embryonic development. They all have this tail. They also have kind of these eyes right here, right? The ear holes. They have this kind of lump shape right here. They all share these characteristics, even though in these later stages here, we end up with very different organisms. Now, this shows evidence of common ancestry or evolution. Because why would something that ends up so different looking start nearly identical, okay, other than the fact that they share a common ancestor? Okay, and then last, body structures, which is the most complicated to remember, but some of our earliest evidence of evolution by studying those fossils that I talked about before. So first, we have body structures. We have homologous, analogous, and vestigial. So first, homologous or divergent evolution, okay? Notice all these same bones. They have a similar bone structure because they share a common ancestor, okay? Now, the human arm is used for grabbing, a cat front paw is used for walking, a whale flipper is used for swimming, and a bat wing is used for flying. All of these are vastly different functions, and yet they share the same basic bone structure, which you can see here and which you colored in your worksheets. But because of this, we know that they shared a common ancestor, maybe very distantly, but they did, okay? And that is because of homologous structures or divergent evolution. Same structure or same bone structure with a different function. They have diverged from the same common ancestor. So if they start with the same common ancestor, we have diverging functions, okay? Next, we have analogous structures or convergent evolution. Now, a fish, bird, mammal, of course, because they're all animals, technically they share a common ancestor, but a very, very, very distant one. Now, they have all developed this structure, the fin, used for swimming. same function, okay? The structure is the same, that kind of thin shape, okay, which is good for moving through the water, changing direction, all because it's the best for its function. They have different common ancestors and yet have the same structure. Just when we talk about their tail fins as well, which we discussed in class, where the shark back fin moves side to side, the dolphin back fin moves up and down. That is because they developed in different pathways. They do not share a recent common ancestor. They developed these because it was the best for its purpose. And then last, we have the vestigial structure. And these are structures that were adaptations for an organism's ancestor, but they're no longer used in the modern organism. Now, these are not evolutionarily bad enough to get rid of it. Like this hip bone in the whale is not something that is hurting the whale. If it did hurt the whale, if it stopped it from reproducing or somehow stopped it from surviving long enough, then eventually those born without them may survive longer. Like I may have given the example of the elephants in Africa. That some we're having an evolution change in the population where more are being born without tusks. Okay, that is because the genetic difference of not having a tusk enabled some of those elephants to live longer and therefore reproduce longer than the ones with tusks. The ones with tusks were killed by poachers for the ivory in their tusks, and then they didn't survive, they didn't reproduce, they didn't pass on those genes for their tusks. So now more and more are born without it. That would be evolutionarily detrimental to them, therefore it's going away. This hip bone in the whale is not hurting them. Wisdom teeth in humans is not particularly hurting us. We just get them removed. The appendix, unless you have appendicitis, it's not killing you and stopping you from reproducing, etc., etc. Vestigial structures are evidence of common ancestry because why else would a whale have hip bones if not for their ancestors having hip bones? Okay, I hope this was a helpful review for you guys and you study hard for your test tomorrow. Thank you for watching.